I found a hidden photo in my deceased son's pocket, and what I saw gave me hope. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of Matthew's bedroom, casting long shadows across the baseball trophies that hadn't been touched in 3 months. 3 months, 1 week, and for days to be exact. I'd been counting each sunrise since the accident, each one a small betrayal. How dare the world continue turning without my son in it? The doctors had called it instantaneous. He didn't suffer. Mrs. Collins, they'd said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. As if knowing my 19-year-old boy died immediately when his car hydroplaned off Cedar Creek Bridge somehow made the hollowness inside me less vast. The rain had been coming down in sheets that night. April in Pennsylvania is treacherous that way. Winter reluctantly releasing its grip, spring announcing itself with violent storms. I stood in the doorway of his room, as I did most mornings, afraid to disturb anything. His bed remained unmade, just as he'd left it that Friday morning. Later, Mom. He'd called over his shoulder, running late for his physics lab at Westfield State. Love you. Those were the last words I'd ever hear from him. Such ordinary words for what would become an extraordinary day. The day that cleaved my life into before and after. Robert, my husband, had already packed away most of Matthew's things from the common areas of the house. He said it was too painful seeing reminders everywhere, but I couldn't bear to erase the evidence of our son. From his own bedroom, that baseball cap still hanging on the bedpost, the pile of textbooks on his desk, the faint smell of his cologne that somehow lingered, defying time and loss. Sarah. Robert's voice came from downstairs. The donation truck will be here in an hour. My heart seized. We'd argued about this for weeks. Robert insisted we needed to move forward, that holding onto Matthew's possessions was preventing us from healing. I knew he was probably right. But knowing and accepting our vastly different territories, just his winter clothes today, I called back, my voice cracking. That's what we agreed. I heard Robert sigh. But he didn't argue. Our grief had taken different shapes. His was structured, organized, dealt with through lists and tasks and forward motion. Mine was chaotic, resistant to schedules or reason. We were drifting apart in our shared tragedy, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap. I opened Matthew's closet door, the hinges protesting with a squeak he would have found annoying. Mom, can you please WD-40 that thing? I could almost hear him say it. I reached for the navy wool peacoat he'd bought with his first paycheck from the campus bookstore. He'd been so proud of that purchase, so grown up in his eyes. Now it hung like an empty shell, a reminder of the boy who'd filled it. With trembling fingers, I lifted it from the hanger, holding it against my chest for a moment. I'd told Robert I'd check the pockets before donating anything. It was a mother's instinct, perhaps, or just another excuse to delay the inevitable. I slipped my hand into the right pocket. Empty. Then the left. Something crinkled against my fingers. I pulled out a folded photograph. Its edges worn from handling. It had clearly been carried around for some time. My heart quickened as I carefully unfolded it. The image was slightly faded, taken maybe a year ago. It showed Matthew standing on Cedar Creek Bridge, the same bridge where he would later lose his life, with his arm around an elderly man I didn't recognize. They were both smiling broadly, the autumn foliage blazing behind them. The old man had kind eyes and a weathered face, his white hair tousled by the wind. I turned the photo over. On the back, in Matthew's distinctive handwriting, were the words, Mr. Sullivan, Day 67. His second chance at the bridge. I frowned, perplexed. Matthew had never mentioned anyone named Sullivan. Who was this man, and what did second chance at the bridge mean? The phrase sent a chill through me. The same bridge where my son had died. Sarah. Robert called again. Everything okay up there? I quickly pocketed the photograph. Fine, I answered, just taking my time. I selected a few winter items and brought them downstairs, where Robert was waiting with empty cardboard boxes. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been 3 months ago. Grief had aged us both. That's all he asked, eyeing the small pile in my arms. For now, I said, not meeting his gaze. I wasn't ready to share the photograph yet. It felt like a message meant just for me, a breadcrumb trail my son had left behind. I needed to understand it first. That night, after Robert had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the photo under the warm circle of lamplight. I studied the old man's face, searching for any clue to his identity. There was something familiar about him, though I was certain we'd never met. I opened my laptop and typed Sullivan Cedar Creek into the search engine, several results appeared. Mostly real estate listings and local business directories, but one headline from the Cedar Creek Chronicle, dated almost exactly a year ago, caught my attention. Local man rescued from bridge jump attempt. My fingers trembled as I clicked the link. The article described how an elderly resident, James Sullivan, 78, had been talked down from a suicide attempt on Cedar Creek Bridge by a young Good Samaritan who happened to be passing by. The young man had stayed with Sullivan for over an hour, convincing him that life was worth living, then drove him to the hospital. Sullivan had later told reporters he owed his life to the stranger who took the time to stop and talk. The young man wasn't named in the article. He'd apparently requested anonymity, but the timing, the location, it had to be Matthew. My throat tightened as I read further. Sullivan had been grieving the loss of his wife of 52 years and had seen no reason to continue living without her. I stared at the photo again, understanding dawning. Day 67. Matthew must have been keeping track of how long Sullivan had been alive since that day on the bridge. He'd saved this man's life, and then continued to check on him. My son, the anonymous Good Samaritan. The next morning, I waited until Robert left for work before driving to the address listed for James Sullivan in the online phone directory. It was a modest bungalow on Elm Street. Its garden meticulously maintained despite the early spring chill. Bright yellow daffodils nodded. In the breeze along the walkway, I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering courage. What would I say to this stranger? Hello, I'm the mother of the boy who saved your life, but he's dead now. The absurdity of the situation nearly made me start the car and drive away. But something kept me there, some need to connect with this piece of Matthew's life I hadn't known about. Finally, I approached the door and knocked. Long moments passed before I heard shuffling footsteps. The door opened to reveal the man from the photograph, slightly more stooped than he'd appeared in the image, but with the same kind eyes. Yes, he said, his voice gentle with the slight tremor of age. Double quotes Mer. Sullivan. I managed to say, my name is Sarah Collins, I'm Matthew Collins' mother. His eyes widened with recognition, then filled with sorrow. Oh, Mrs. Collins. I read about what happened. Please come in. He led me to a living room filled with books and family photographs. On the mantel was the same photo I'd found in Matthew's pocket, framed alongside a picture of an elegant older woman who must have been Mrs. Sullivan. I've been wanting to reach out to you and your husband, he said, lowering himself carefully into an armchair. But I wasn't sure if you knew about me, or if my presence would only cause more pain. I only just found out, I admitted, perching on the edge of the sofa. Matthew never mentioned you. Sullivan nodded, a small smile crossing his face. That doesn't surprise me. He was modest about what he did. Didn't want any recognition. He gestured to the photo on the mantel. That was taken about 6 months after we met. We were celebrating. Celebrating what? I asked. 6 months of me being alive when I wasn't supposed to be, he said simply. Your son would check on me every couple of weeks. Bring groceries sometimes, or just sit and talk. I tried to pay him once, and he looked so offended I never offered again. He chuckled at the memory. He said my company was payment enough. Tears blurred my vision. This sounded exactly like the Matthew I knew, generous, compassionate, unwilling to take credit for his good deeds. The last time I saw him was 2 weeks before the accident, Sullivan continued. He seemed happy. Excited about his summer plans. He mentioned he was going to tell you about me soon, that he thought enough time had passed that I wouldn't mind. Tell me about that day, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The day you met. Sullivan's eyes grew distant with memory. It was raining, much like the night he died. April seems to bring the worst storms. He sighed deeply. I'd been widowed for 3 months. Eleanor, my wife, had been everything to me for over 50 years. When cancer took her, it took my reason for living too. He paused, gathering himself, that morning. I decided I couldn't bear another day without her. I drove to Cedar Creek Bridge, parked my car, and stood at the railing for almost an hour, gathering my courage. The water was high from the spring rains, rushing violently below. Just as I'd worked up the nerve to climb over, a car pulled up behind mine. Sullivan smiled softly. Your son approached me like we were old friends meeting for coffee. Casual, no alarm in his voice, even though he must have known what I was contemplating. He said, Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but my car's acting up. Could you help me take a look? It was such an ordinary request that I automatically stepped back from the railing, My heart swelled with pride and sorrow simultaneously. My clever, compassionate boy, of course. There was nothing wrong with his car, Sullivan continued. He just needed a reason to engage me, to pull me back from the edge. Before I knew it, we were sitting in his car to get out of the rain, and he was asking about my life, about Eleanor. He listened, really listened, as I poured out my grief. No platitudes, no empty reassurances. Just genuine human connection. Tears were streaming down my face now. I could picture it so clearly, Matthew's patient expression, his attentive silence. He'd always been a good listener. After about an hour, Sullivan went on. He said something I'll never forget. He said, "Mr. Sullivan, I can't pretend to understand the depth of your loss. But I believe Eleanor wouldn't want her absence to be the reason for your absence too. That would be two lights going out instead of one." A sob escaped me. Those words, so wise for someone so young. Matthew had always possessed an old soul. Sullivan reached across and patted my hand. He drove me to the hospital himself, waited while they evaluated me, even called the next day to check in. And then he just kept checking in. Became part of my life. I had no idea, I whispered. "He spoke about you often," Sullivan said. "How proud he was of your strength, your kindness. He said he learned compassion from watching you with your patients." The reference to my work as a hospice nurse brought fresh tears to my eyes. "The last time we spoke," Sullivan continued, his voice gentle, "Matthew told me he was grateful for that rainy day on the bridge, said it taught him that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to unexpected connections. He said meeting me had changed his perspective on life." I sat very still, absorbing his words. Something shifted inside me, not healing exactly, but the beginning of understanding. Double quotes, Mrs. Collins, Sullivan said, leaning forward, "I've been keeping something for Matthew. He asked me to hold onto it until he told you about our friendship. I think he would want you to have it now." He walked slowly to a small writing desk in the corner and returned with a leather-bound journal. "He started this the day after we met. Said it helped him process things." With trembling hands, I accepted the journal. The cover was worn, the pages slightly warped as though it had been carried everywhere. I opened to the first entry, dated exactly 1 year and 3 months ago. April 14, 2024. I met a man on the bridge today. He was planning to jump. Something made me stop. Maybe the way he stood there, so determined yet so lost. I didn't know what to say. So I pretended my car was broken. Ridiculous, I know. But it worked. His name is James Sullivan. And he lost his wife recently. I don't know if I helped him or just delayed the inevitable, but I'm going to check on him tomorrow. There was something in his eyes when he talked about his wife. Such profound love. I want to understand that kind of connection. The entries continued, chronicling Matthew's growing friendship with Sullivan, his reflections on life and loss, his evolving perspective on what matters most. It was like hearing my son's voice again, his thoughtfulness, his humor, his depth. I turned page after page, hungry for his words. Then I reached an entry from just 3 weeks before the accident that made my breath catch. March 5, 2025. Mr. Sullivan took me to Eleanor's grave today. It was the first time he'd been able to visit since the funeral. We brought daffodils, her favorite. He told me something that keeps echoing in my mind. Grief is just love with nowhere to go. It made me think about how we process loss. Maybe grief isn't something to get over but rather something to channel into new connections, new purpose. Mur.S. is doing better now, day 326. He started volunteering at the senior center, teaching art classes. Says it gives his days meaning. I'm proud of him. Going to tell Mom about him soon. Think they'd get along great. Both have that caretaker spirit. I closed the journal, overcome. Sullivan watched me quietly, understanding in his eyes. He saved my life twice, he said finally. Once on the bridge, and again by showing me how to live with loss. I wish I could have returned the favor somehow. But you have, I whispered, clutching the journal to my chest. You've given me back a piece of my son I didn't know existed. We talked for hours that day. Sullivan showed me artwork he'd created in his grief therapy, paintings of Eleanor, of the bridge, of Matthew. He told me stories of their visits, filling in blank spaces in the last year of my son's life. By the time I left, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Sullivan's garden. Please come again, he said as he walked me to the door. I have more of Matthew's writings, things he shared with me. And I'd like to hear your stories too. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As I turned to go, Sullivan touched my arm gently. Mrs. Collins, Sarah, there's something else Matthew told me. Something I think you should know. That day on the bridge, after we'd been talking for about an hour, I asked him why he stopped, why he, a complete stranger, would take the time to intervene when dozens of others had driven past. Do you know what he said? I shook my head. He said, "My mom always taught me that sometimes all a person needs is for someone to notice they're struggling. That the simple act of stopping can be the difference between a tragedy and a second chance." Sullivan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He said he learned that from watching you with your hospice patients, how you always made time to really see them, not just their illness. I drove home in a daze, the journal on the passenger seat beside me like a precious cargo. When I pulled into our driveway, Robert was standing on the porch, his face tight with worry. "Where have you been?" he demanded as I approached. "I've been calling for hours." I realized I'd left my phone at home in my haste to meet Sullivan. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing where to begin. "I found something of Matthew's, something important inside." I showed him the photograph in Sullivan's journal, explaining everything in a rush of words. Robert listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder. "Our son saved someone's life," he said finally, his voice breaking, "and we never knew." "He saved more than that," I said, thinking of Sullivan's artwork, his volunteer work, the lives he was touching now because Matthew had stopped on that bridge. He created a ripple effect of compassion that's still moving outward. That night, Robert and I sat together on Matthew's bed, taking turns reading from the journal. There were entries that made us laugh through our tears, moments of insight that seemed beyond Matthew's years, and raw expressions of fear and doubt that reminded us he was still so young, still figuring things out. "Listen to this," Robert said, his finger marking a page near the end. "Sometimes I wonder if one life can really make a difference in this world. Then I look at Mr. Sullivan, how different his story could have been, how many lives would have been affected by his absence, and I think maybe that's how it works. We touch one life, which touches another, and another. Maybe we can't change the whole world, but we can change someone's whole world." We held each other then, crying for our lost boy and for the wisdom he'd left behind. For the first time since the accident, our grief felt like something we were sharing rather than something driving us apart. The next morning, I woke early and went to Matthew's room. The donation boxes Robert had brought up were still empty. I ran my hand over the navy peacoat, remembering the photograph that had led me to Sullivan. Then, with a deep breath, I took one of the boxes and began to carefully fold Matthew's winter clothes, not to erase him from our home, but to make space for the new understanding of who he had been. When I lifted the peacoat, something else fell from the pocket, a small, folded piece of paper I'd missed before. I opened it to find a list in Matthew's handwriting. At the top, he'd written Bridge people and below were 5 names. James Sullivan Day 339, Maria Vasquez Day 127, Kenneth Wright Day 94, Lily Chen Day 58, and David Martinez Day 12. My hands trembled as I realized what I was looking at. Matthew hadn't just saved Sullivan. There had been others, for other people he had encountered at that bridge, for other lives he had touched in the same way. I called Robert upstairs, showed him the list with shaking hands. "We need to find them," I whispered, "all of them." It took us months to locate all 5 people on Matthew's list. Each story was different, yet each confirmed what we'd learned from Sullivan. Our son had made a habit of driving by Cedar Creek Bridge, especially on rainy days. He'd stop whenever he saw someone alone at the railing, finding some way to engage them, to connect. Sometimes it was pretending to need directions, sometimes asking to borrow a phone. Once, he'd even brought his dog along and asked if the person would help him look for a lost toy. Maria Vasquez, a college student who'd been overwhelmed by debt and academic pressure, now ran a peer counseling program at her university. Kenneth Wright, a veteran struggling with PTSD, had started a support group for other vets. Lily Chen, who'd lost her job and been facing eviction, now worked at a homeless shelter. And David Martinez, the most recent name on the list, had been considering suicide after his divorce. He was now training to become a crisis counselor. Each of them had a story about Matthew, his patience, his lack of judgment, his way of listening that made them feel truly heard. And each of them had, in their own way, transformed their second chance into something meaningful. We invited them all to our home one Sunday afternoon, along with James Sullivan. It was strange and beautiful, this gathering of people connected by our son, people who might never have met him under ordinary circumstances. People whose lives had been saved by his simple decision to stop and notice their pain as they shared stories and exchanged contact information, forming connections with each other. I stood in the doorway watching. Robert came up beside me, slipping his arm around my waist. He created a community, he murmured, wonder in his voice. Even after he's gone, they have each other. Bridge people, I said. Remembering Matthew's list, they're building bridges for others now. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Robert and I walked to Cedar Creek Bridge together. It was our first time visiting the site of the accident since the funeral. The summer sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water that had taken our son's life. We stood where he had stood so many times, where he had reached out to strangers in their darkest moments. I've been thinking, Robert said, gazing at the rushing water below. What if we created a foundation in Matthew's name, something focused on suicide prevention, maybe, or community connection? The Bridge Project, I suggested, the name coming to me suddenly. For people who need someone to notice they're struggling, Robert nodded, his eyes bright with purpose. We could train volunteers to recognize warning signs, to approach with compassion like Matthew did. Not just at bridges, but anywhere people might be in crisis. For the first time in 6 months, I felt something like hope unfurling within me. It wasn't that the pain of losing Matthew had diminished. I knew that grief would always be part of me now. But alongside it, something new was growing. A sense of purpose, a way to channel that grief into action, just as Matthew had written about in his journal, 1 year after finding the photograph in Matthew's pocket. The Bridge Project had grown beyond anything we could have imagined, with Sullivan as our first volunteer coordinator and the other Bridge people forming the core team. We'd established training programs in 3 counties. Local mental health professionals donated their time, and a grant from the state health department allowed us to create educational materials and a 24-hour hotline. On the anniversary of Matthew's death, we held a ceremony at Cedar Creek Bridge. Not in mourning but in celebration of the lives that had been touched, directly and indirectly, by our son's compassion. Sullivan spoke about second chances. Maria shared poetry she'd written about finding hope in unexpected places. Kenneth brought his support group, standing tall and proud in their veterans' caps. As I looked out at the gathered crowd, friends, family, volunteers, and people whose lives had been saved by the Bridge Project, I felt Matthew's presence more strongly than I had since losing him. Not in the painful way of early grief, but as a gentle reminder that love never truly disappears, it just changes form. That evening, back at home, I sat in Matthew's room, now transformed into an office for the Bridge Project, and opened his journal to an entry I'd read countless times over the past year. Today, Mr. Sullivan asked why I stop at the bridge so often. I told him about that psychology lecture last semester, how Professor Linden talked about the bystander effect, how people assume someone else will help in a crisis. It made me think about all the cars that must drive past someone standing alone at a railing, all those people thinking someone else will stop. I decided I wanted to be the someone who stops. Maybe that's all any of us can do, be the one who notices, the one who reaches out, the one who creates a moment of genuine human connection in a world that often feels disconnected. Is it enough? I don't know, but it's something. It was something indeed. Something that had created ripples we were still discovering. Matthew hadn't been perfect. He'd been just a 19-year-old boy with homework and girl problems and dirty laundry piling up in his room. But he'd understood something fundamental about human connection that many people never grasp in a lifetime. I closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf, next to the framed photograph of Matthew and Sullivan on the bridge. The sun was setting, casting the same golden light that had illuminated the bridge earlier. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for the 19 years we'd had with our son, but for the hidden depths we were still discovering. For the legacy he'd left without ever intending to. The pain of losing him would never completely fade. There would still be days when grief would knock the breath from my lungs. Moments when I'd reach for the phone to tell him something before remembering he was gone. But there would also be this community he'd created, these lives he'd touched, this purpose he'd inspired. In finding that photograph, I'd found more than just a hidden aspect of my son's life. I'd found a way forward through grief, a path illuminated by the compassion he'd shown to strangers on a bridge, and in that discovery was the most unexpected gift of all, hope. Blooming like those daffodils in Sullivan's garden, persistent and bright against the lingering shadows of winter.